You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
The Halloween Chamber. Walkabout. Chapter 2. With only an hour before nightfall, the professor decided he would have a brief look around outside to familiarize himself with his surroundings. He found his way through one of the back doors after mistakenly entering the kitchens, where one of the brothers pointed the way. The huge abbey was built on a piece of level ground, and he wondered whether it had been leveled for the foundations all those centuries ago. Walking through the vegetable garden, he passed on through a small gate onto the sparsely vegetated scrubland, and continued his uphill walk for about 100 yards to where the cemetery was positioned. On through the cemetery gate he looked around at all the gravestones surrounding the central mausoleum. The few inscriptions, which were still legible after hundreds of years of erosion, revealed most of the interred were residents of Grimsfell, dating back to the 1500s, and only a few appeared to be the graves of monks. He guessed that the mausoleum must contain the others. He stopped to ponder whether the graves were cut into the underlying limestone, as the soil layer here would surely be too thin for a proper burial. The mausoleum was long abandoned and neglected like the rest of the cemetery, with lumps of masonry missing, forming little piles of overgrown limestone debris. Ancient thick stems of ivy wove their way across and into the stonework, probing the cracks, growing ever larger by the evergreen's increasing girth, forcing the structure apart. Some of the stained glass of the arched windows still remained, but most had gone the way of the masonry, disappearing into the overgrown soil over years of neglect. However, the badly weathered doors were still intact and firmly shackled with rusted iron padlocks of considerable antiquity. He could see that the building had a lower level by the long gaps every now and then along the lower edge of the side walls to allow some light and air to enter. He would very much like to see inside, and made a mental note to ask the abbot for the keys. The brooding mountain above seemed as threatening as it did protective, dwarfing the abbey and the small village further down towards the sea cliffs. Dusk was soon upon him as he turned to go back to the abbey gardens, when he glimpsed movement to the right of his field of vision. He saw a small group of large black birds approaching the abbey roof. That evening the abbot invited him to eat with them in the main hall. "It's a bit dreary out the back in winter. Did you walk far?" inquired the abbot. "Just as far as the mausoleum. It's quite a large building. Does it go down far?" "It seems to be on 2 levels, but I haven't been in there myself. It is said that at one time there was a well that reached down to the underground river, and that the mausoleum was built next to it, and later incorporated into the side of the building. It fell into disrepair centuries ago, and as far as I am aware, no one has ever explored it in recent times." Intriguing," commented the professor with eager thoughts of exploring it himself. "You have crows or ravens on the roof, I saw last evening?" "Yes, both, Professor." "Do they live in the roof of the abbey?" "Apparently not. They just visit from time to time from elsewhere. Just 3 ravens and a crow." "A crow? Why are ravens with a crow?" "Goodness knows," replied the abbot, tucking into his meal. "What are your plans for tomorrow with regard to Brother Edward?" he said, quickly changing the subject. "I'm still thinking about it. Can you ask him if he would see me tomorrow afternoon?" "Yes, I should see him at morning prayer. Do you plan a visit to our little village down the hill?" "Certainly. There are 2 places I would very much like to see whilst I'm here, abbot. The village and inside that mausoleum." "I think the mausoleum is best left to its own devices, Professor. It'll be far too dangerous to enter." "Yes, I suppose that's right, but doesn't it fascinate you as to just what it looks like inside after all those centuries of neglect?" Well, yes, it does, but there's little time to take on such an exploratory task as that, and the dangers of falling masonry would need to be evaluated carefully before anyone entered. The professor's glass of wine went to his head, and so he excused himself to bed. The next morning he was up early and started making notes about how he should best interview Brother Edward to try and discover what was troubling him. As the weather was clement, he decided he would take a walk down to the village before hopefully speaking with the troubled monk in the afternoon. The walk from the abbey down to the village was very different from last evening's walk behind the abbey, where he felt trapped between the huge abbey and the mountain. Ahead of him was the open sea, with the village tucked inland about a quarter-mile or so. A row of asymmetrical wind-swept trees, bent by the insistent wind from the sea, protected one another, the first in line being much smaller than the next because of the protection it provided by taking the full brunt of the wind, resulting in each tree being noticeably larger than the one before. He counted 7 trees. Passing the trees along the meandering pathway, he came to the first cottage, with its shutters firmly clamped to its windows, and spotted a villager taking in her washing from the line between alarmingly leaning posts. "Hello there," he called, sounding of good cheer. "Are you down from the abbey?" she asked, looking rather concerned. "That's right, just sorting out a few problems for the abbot. Only there's something very strange going on up there." "Really?" "Well, some of the villagers go up there a couple of times a week to help with the cleaning and other things that need doing," she said. "But they come back with tales of weird behavior by some of the monks." "That's interesting. The abbot mentioned it, too. What sort of weird behavior?" "We think it's some sort of madness. I'm not surprised. It would drive me mad to be stuck up there all the time. Where would I be able to speak with some of the people who work there?" "I reckon the best place to ask would be at the pub. It's further along past the post office. You see that blue sign on the left?" She leaned forward towards him and aimed a finger. "Well, that's the shop sign, and the post office is next, and then the pub. It's called the Witch's Brew." "Well, that sounds interesting. No bat wings or spider legs in the ale, I hope," he said with a chuckle. "I wouldn't know. I rarely go in there," she replied dryly, not appreciating his joke. "Well, thanks for your help. I'll see what I can find out at the pub. What's your name, by the way?" Rose Bennett." She hesitated. "Well, thanks then, Rose. I'll be on my way." The professor turned, giving a small wave to the attractive dark-haired young woman. No one else seemed to be around, so he reckoned they must all be in the pub. Just past the lonely-looking red letterbox outside of the post office, the Witch's Brew came into view, set back around the corner by one of the few trees in the village. Nailed to the tree was a tired-looking poster inviting people to the pub's Christmas celebrations next month, entitled The Christmas Children. The pub was elaborately themed with all things witchy, what looked like a couple of stuffed black cats lurking in the shadows, lots of bats hanging precariously from the ceiling, and the occasional old broomstick propped in the corners. As expected, it was low-beamed, with an ancient-looking flagstone floor, well worn into a shallow trough leading up to the bar. Small groups of people inhabited the dim alcoves around the single large room, with a few of the locals appearing interested in the newcomer. The professor spotted an old man sitting on his own, leaning heavily on his robust, knurled walking stick, looking exceptionally world-weary, and asked him if he would like to join him for a drink. "That's very kind of you, sir," he said, touching his greasy hat. "I'll have the house ale, if you please." "Okay, I think I'll try it, too." The landlord finally emerged from the cellar, clutching 2 bottles of red wine for a customer, and set them down in front of a heavily bearded, long-haired man standing at the far end of the bar. "There we are," he said triumphantly, as he took the money from the man without a word of thanks in return, and turned to the professor. "What can I get for you?" I thought I would try the house ale and one for the old gentleman, too, he asked, turning to acknowledge him. Are you visiting these parts? Questioned the landlord, looking him up and down suspiciously. I'm exploring, really. I've just come down from the Abbey, he explained. Could you help me? I'm looking for anyone who works up there, just to ask them a few questions. We've got questions, too, he said abruptly, lowering his eyebrows as if readying himself in anticipation of the details, exchanging glances with the old man. Is it about reports of the monks acting strangely? Asked the professor. Well, you could say that. More like they're going mad. I've seen some of the monks wandering about near the cliffs and behind the old mausoleum over the years. Couldn't make conversation, though. It seemed like they were in a trance. That is interesting. I was contacted through my department at the university by the abbot to ask if I could investigate the cause of their disturbing and bizarre behavior. My area of expertise, really, although I'd be grateful if you could keep that to yourself. I could ask around to see if there's one of the cleaners who would speak to you. I'd like to know more, too. You've got me intrigued now, he said, poking a finger into his straggly beard. If you wouldn't mind, the professor replied gratefully. The old man listened intently, but said nothing more as he savored the house ale with one hand and held on firmly to his stick with the other. Well, I'll ask around. Can you call again tomorrow? Who shall I say is inquiring? Professor Benson. I'm a doctor of psychiatry, he admitted, half expecting some sort of negative reaction from the landlord. Professor, eh? I think you must be the only professor who has ever come to the Witch's Brew, or even to all of Grimsfell. As I say, I'll ask around. Oh, by the way, what's the origin of the pub's name? Was this witch country at one time? Legend has it that an old crone named of Alice Bennet once lived here in the village and had preyed on young women and children. If you're interested, I'll tell you more about it when I see you tomorrow. That's kind of you, if it's no bother. My profession is trying to understand the mind, so it's quite relevant to try and understand what turns people's minds to the supernatural belief in gods, demons, and witches. I'll see you tomorrow. The old man looked up and touched his hat. There was still time to do a bit more exploring before dusk, so the professor walked behind the pub and followed a little path back in the direction of the cliffs, along by a cemetery and a series of vegetable garden allotments which had seen better days. A rugged-looking woman, struggling with an enormous wheelbarrow, appeared from behind a ramshackle shed. The professor called out to her. "Do you need a hand with that, my dear?" "No, I'll be fine. Nearly there, thanks." "I thought I'd go down to the sea. Which is the best way?" "Go along the path towards the hill," she pointed. "That's the lover's way to the cliff crag above the sea, where all the courting goes on. From there you'll see a steep path down to the sea. Mind you, there are no beaches here, just wee rocky bays you can only get to by their own paths. You'll need sturdy boots for those, so as to not lose your footing. It really is treacherous, so you take care." "Well, thanks for the warning. I'll see how I get on." After following the pathway for a while, the professor reached the small hill and trudged to the top of the cliffs. Ahead and down an incline he could see a large chunk of rock jutting out above the sea. More of a lover's leap, he thought. Further along the path he could see the way down to a tiny rock-strewn beach far below. Not for him, he thought, turning his direction, and then his thoughts to the afternoon's meeting. Exhausted after his walk back up to the Abbey, he lay down on his bed with his notes in his hand to finalize how he would conduct the interview. That is, if the abbot was able to get the monk's agreement. At lunch, the abbot confirmed that Brother Edward was willing to be interviewed, and that he told him he didn't really know what it was about, other than an interview about life as a resident at the Abbey for some research project for a visiting Professor Benson. The professor thought that was a clever idea and started to rewrite some of his notes. The little monk he had met when he first arrived brought him a message from the abbot to say the interview was planned for an hour's time, and was that all right? Confirming this, the professor sat on his bed in a dilemma. Which color bow tie would best suit the situation? He was well aware of the psychological effects of his colored point of focus, which had been the subject of many afternoon tea debates at the university. Wearing a bright red bow tie, the professor knocked on the abbot's study door. Abbot Gregory opened the door and appeared with a concerned expression upon his face as he beckoned him to come inside. "He's rather agitated," he whispered. The professor nodded as he moved over to where Brother Edward was sitting with his back to the door, while the abbot left the room. "Hello, I'm Professor Benson, and I'm very grateful for your time. I wanted to know about aspects of monastic life through your experience for part of a research paper I plan to write. It's a life which very few people are familiar with, and so it will be interesting to compare and contrast to normal life," explained the professor, convincingly, he thought. The man slowly raised his head and nodded. He looked terrible, as if he hadn't slept for a week. "What would you like to know?" "About what you do here and how the day goes for you, and how you get on with the other brothers. General things, really. Do you want to continue, because you don't look too well?" he felt compelled to ask. "I'm going crazy." "Crazy?" he asked in a deliberately concerned voice. "I don't know what I'm doing half the time. My mind feels controlled, and I have these bad thoughts." "Do you want to talk about that instead, off the record?" "I do need help. Please," he anguished. The professor sat down beside him. "How can I help?" he said softly. "I have to do things I don't want to do." "Who is making you do things?" "That's the problem. I don't know. It's just that I'm compelled by thoughts and images that insist I must do them, thinking things I don't want to think, preparing me for something." "The abbot tells me you went away for a few days. Where did you go?" "But that was a dream, wasn't it?" "Brother Edward, when did you start to feel unwell and controlled?" "About 2 years ago. I began to have bad dreams and then nightmares. What are dreams and what reality is blurred, and it became worse over the last year or so. Horrible visions torment me and convince me to leave the abbey and steal a child from the village. I know I must do this soon, and I practiced it in a dream. But you say it wasn't a dream? That I'd gone missing for a few days?" "That's what the abbot told me, and your brothers would have known, but probably didn't like to say. I don't know." "My head is screaming, aching, because I want to tell you about the details and images in my dreams and nightmares, but I just daren't reveal them to anyone." "Why not? What will happen if you tell me?" said the professor kindly. "Terrible things. That's all I dare say. I'm sorry, but I'm not myself." "That's fine, brother. You must rest now, and if you wish to speak further about this, please feel free to call me any time, because we must try and understand this disturbing mystery and get you well again." "Thank you, Professor. I'm so sorry we didn't get to talk about the life at the Abbey in the sense you wanted for your research. I haven't a life at the moment. It's been drained out of me." Professor Benson helped Brother Edward from his chair and called for another brother to help take him to his room, and then returned to his own room to make notes before supper.